Okay, my journey to the Dark Tower continues. I just finished reading, well, I finished it a few days ago, but Wizard and Glass by Stephen King, the fourth book in the Dark Tower series. This is the longest book, I think by a decent margin. My copy of this is about 900 pages. It's a little bit over, but kind of right around there. I'm extremely excited to talk about this book. So I've been thinking on it a little bit since I finished it over the last couple of days. And I've seen some extremely high praise of the book. A lot of reviews I've read and just other commentary. Most people generally love it, have it ranked pretty highly in the Dark Tower series. And not only that, but also pretty high on their list of Stephen King novels, just period. So starting out with it, I wanted to comment on, I really enjoyed The Wastelands. I thought it was a great book. I thought the ending with Arcatet, the sequence with Blaine, the way it just abruptly ended, I thought was extremely strange as a genuine cliffhanger. And obviously we don't have this problem now, but Wizard and Glass was published like 6 or so years after The Wasteland. So apparently, like in real time, people reading it were a little upset that it took so long to get to it. And I will agree. I'm not sure when you're talking about the series as a whole, I don't think it ultimately matters. But when you're looking at it from a book by book perspective, I think it has to be a little bit of a flaw. So I don't really know if I level that at The Wastelands or Wizard and Glass, but I think that it's very strange that that sequence is basically just abruptly kind of cut in half. I'm not sure if this was the case from earlier editions, but my copy literally has like the last 10 or 12 pages from The Wastelands as a quote unquote prologue of this book to kind of reorient you into the scene, because it literally picks up just like immediately in that, direct moment. And that I think is really weird. Again, it doesn't matter from like the totality of the series from that perspective, but it really does matter from if you're looking at Wizard and Glass as a whole, it is a little strange that it picks up kind of like right in the middle. And so for that reason, I think I love the Blaine sequence with Arcatet and the way that it finishes up. I just think that that's a really kind of strange way to start the book, with this kind of like picking up from something basically like in the middle of it. And I like the resolution of that sequence, even though we don't get a lot of it. And I knew that this book, just from hearing commentary and other things, that this book is mostly set in the past and it's telling some of Roland's key backstory. I did not realize how much of this book is essentially is doing that. So my copy of the book, basically about 100 pages in, you get the ending of the Blaine sequence. The Quartet travels a little bit, and they basically come across, and in the distance they see the glass castle or palace, and then they kind of get a little bit of a sense of the Thinny. And I guess by this point they've crossed over into like a different version, basically like what we see from The Stand, of Kansas, which has been ravaged by the super flu that is in The Stand. So there's kind of a cool connection there. And then Roland is kind of like reminded of this story, and he feels that he finally needs to tell it. And so basically from the 100-page mark through, I think like page 800 or so, is all set in the past, with the exception of a very, very brief interlude. I have heard some people that are not super happy with that from a structure perspective. I will say that I think the book is a extremely slow burn, particularly in this section. I think establishing the characters in this whole separate town kind of on the outer rim called Hambry, and kind of like the surrounding areas and all the different characters, I think it ends up being a fascinating plot arc, but it really does take a long time to kind of build to it. So I think it's strange. Personally, I wish that we had gotten the ending of the Blaine sequence and basically gotten them to this point where Roland is about to tell the story just at the ending of the Wastelands. I mean, it might add like 80, 90 pages to the end of that book, but still, if you do that, it would be shorter than Wizard and Glass would be. I think if you did that and then you just basically ended with Roland saying, I have to confront my past, and then Wizard and Glass is going to begin with this story, I think that would work a lot better, and I wish that's how it was done. But regardless, I think when you look at the structure of the book, at least from my perspective, it's one of the oddest from King's books that I've read, because you do have like this 100-page start, which is really ending a sequence that was began in the Wastelands. You have like a 700-page chunk of this backstory, none of which really is set with Arcatet. And then you have like a very, I will say, kind of a rushed epilogue of like 100 or so pages where the story's finally done. They're starting to move forward. Some of that is still Eddie, Susan, and Jake dealing with the aftermath of what Roland has told them and kind of talking through it with him. So you're really, the actual like plot dynamics of them getting to this glass castle and it being like the Wizard of Oz type scene is like extremely short at the end of the book, and it does feel a little tacked on, I will say that. So that is really my only critique of the book. If you can get past the structure, I think the contents of the book are absolutely amazing. I think this backstory is much needed from Roland's perspective. I think it gives you really learn everything you need to know about Roland from this book. It's a, and I am going to spoil this just because I have to talk about it. But it ends up being an extremely tragic story for Roland and for some people in the town that are around him. And I think you learn everything you need to know about him, why he's so determined on his quest for the Dark Tower, and why he's not willing to let anything stand in his way. I also think seeing Cuthbert and Elaine is awesome, and I think the parallels, King just beautifully parallels Cuthbert to Eddie and then Elaine to Susanna, and just it's awesome to kind of see as you're hearing for hundreds of pages this just kind of very slow, methodical backstory sequence. You can see Eddie and Cuthbert, and I think that construction from a character perspective is just brilliant, and that speaks to how well King wrote these characters and just his amazing construction of this world. So essentially, I mean, like I said, it's a slow burn. From a plot perspective, there's honestly not a ton that happens, with the exception of kind of like a few key instances. But what King does really well, again, is he sets up these character dynamics and he slowly kind of builds tension all throughout the story until it kind of coalesces in this very satisfying ending of this sequence. And when you get to that point, it's basically impossible to put it down. It's such a good page turner. So I love what we see from Roland and his past quartet and all of their dynamics. I think that you see Roland in the most flawed form that you'll ever see him. We know that he's kind of like a masterful gunslinger. He's very smart. He's got all the skills that he needs, but you see here that he has a lot of learning still to do, and he makes a ton of mistakes along the way, and it really costs him and people around him. And I think that really helps build, again, his character arc to getting to the point where he would be in our main storyline on the quest for the Dark Tower. The other big character to introduce is Susan Delgado, who is Roland's love interest in this book. I thought she was a good character. I wish that she had a little bit more to do outside of their romantic connection. But again, I think ultimately at the end of the day, it is about Roland. And honestly, the same thing for Cuthbert and Elaine. It's really about insofar as how all their dynamics relate to him, and ultimately what he's going to learn and go through to get him back to our kind of modern day point on this journey. So when Susan is introduced very early, I think that she's an interesting character. And the King does such a good job of dropping her into this really terrible situation. she's lost her dad. She's living with her aunt. And I do think that there's so many good instances between Cordelia, her aunt, and Susan in this book of just like their dynamics. They disagree all the time. They fight, they argue. And I think just so many of those conversations and character moments are really, really strong in this book, especially in the early part. Maybe like the first third of this flashback sequence or so. And I mean, she's basically going to be married off to the mayor, who's like significantly older than him. She is just like absolutely revolted by this person, but to kind of like secure her status in this town and to kind of secure her financial footing as well, she's going to do it. And she's kind of signed this pact to do so. And I will say, I think my MVP of this book is the witch Rhea of the Coos. Such a good character. She's introduced pretty early here with Susan. I think there's not a ton of pure horror in this series. I think we got a little bit in the Wastelands with kind of like the haunted house that Eddie describes going to, and then that Jake has to go to cross into Midworld. But I think that Rhea kind of represents the best like pure horror-esque villain that King has, at least so far in this series. I thought she's excellent. She's scary. Her dialogue, just the way that she carries herself, with this mutated cat that she has and has a connection to the snake that she like wears around her neck, just to the way that she lives, how she will curse somebody at just the drop of a hat. Amazing character, and I loved every part of it that she was in. And I thought maybe the highlight of the whole book for me, or close to it, is that early sequence where Susan travels to her, and Susan is freaked out about going to her and seeing her. We don't really know much about Rhea yet. But then I don't even know if you want to call it a medical exam, because it's definitely way more intrusive than that. But when Rhea is basically doing what Cordelia has, hired her to do, that whole sequence, I thought from Susan's perspective was absolutely chilling. And again, just really, really good. I think, you get a true introduction to the pink glass that ends up being like basically the MacGuffin of this story that's so important. I think Marilyn's Rainbow is what it's called, and this is one kind of part of it. Really good sequence there. And again, you get where Rhea puts Susan in a trance and basically tells her to do something, and it's going to happen. But you don't know like specifically what she said or what's going to happen. So that, I thought just this whole sequence was brilliant. And then from there, you kind of get this, you have the Katet is being introduced into the town. They're kind of doing their auditing or counting of all these different things on behalf of I think it was called was it the association? I can't remember. But basically they've been sent here to be kept out of the way by their fathers, to be kept in a safer place. But then obviously they discover that something very much is gone awry. I think the juxtaposition of our Katet against the big coffin hunters is great. That early sequence they have where one of them runs across Shimi in the bar, and then Cuthbert ultimately stands up, and then it ends up being a kind of a standoff from all three of them on each side. That really ends up being the inciting incident between both of these groups. And then I think you get kind of really interesting dynamics here where the Katet's still trying to figure out their way around town, get to know people, but also they're starting to learn that things are not quite right. This is where they'll discover Eyebolt Canyon and the Thinny, again, connecting it to the beginning of this book. And the big coffin hunters basically know they want to get rid of these guys, and that they seem to be more than they're letting on, and hinting that they're gunslingers, which they'll obviously come to notice later. And there's kind of like both sides are trying to learn about the other while staying clear. And I think this was a really cool part of the book where you're also, as a reader, kind of trying to figure out how this is going to unfold. So I thought this was excellent. And there's a lot of other characters that are introduced. And again, that speaks to, from a plot perspective, there's not a ton happening, but there's a lot of character dynamics and a lot of slow kind of moments in the passage of time that is really, really strong. And I think King excels at that. He then well, we then get the sequence, not really a sequence, but just the entire arc of Susan and Roland, where they kind of meet by happenstance. They more formally are introduced when the quartet is introduced in front of the town, like the mayor and the commissioner of whatever, the Horsemen's Association or whatever it's called, on behalf of the town. And then this begins this kind of next sequence of will they, won't they? They know they love each other. They're falling in love, but it's the classic forbidden Romeo and Juliet. They can't be together because contractually Susan is, set to marry the mayor, and you have that certain amount of time. And again, I think this is excellent. I think King sets up this brilliant, like, they want to be together so bad, but they can't be together. And so that creates this kind of will they, won't they? Ultimately, kind of like part 2 of that big flashback sequence is they ultimately do end up falling in love and they are together. And I think King, his desire was to write just about kind of that like young, blind love. And this was really one of Roland's huge flaws and consequences, is he couldn't see past the actions of him being with Susan. He didn't realize the consequences that it was going to have, both with his quartet and then personally with Susan. So this is where I think, again, speaking to this book just being very kind of like a long drawn out thing, is once they kind of decide they're just going to be together, you do get a lot of Roland's very distracted. He's with her. Cuthbert and Elaine are very upset about this. They're trying to kind of go about their business, but it almost seems like Roland is in a trance. Susan's aunt Cordelia is very skeptical and suspicious of kind of what Susan is up to, and they kind of keep having worse and worse fights. And the big coffin hunters are basically planning for, you'll learn this later, I guess. It happens at some point in the sequence when Roland is with Susan, but they discover these big oil tankers, and you learn that the kind of the big bad John Farson, and then, I mean, ultimately you come to know that it's Randall Flagg, the Man in Black. They're trying to basically, use what everybody else in society thinks are these outdated kind of oil rigs. They're going to use that to fuel all these different machines, and that's going to be kind of like their big push to fight against what we call the Association or the good guys. So that's kind of like leading to this bigger set piece of conflict between the two of them, and this is what the Roland and Cuthbert and Elaine figure this out, right? And so they're trying to get word back to Roland's father back in Gilead and kind of try to uncover this. But again, because Roland is so he's so just entranced with Susan that, again, stuff really falls by the wayside when it shouldn't after they discover this. And I do think it's interesting that all the while Rhea still has access to be able to, this is where you learn that she's able to see basically everything by using Marilyn's rainbow, by looking into the glass. And I thought that was a cool revelation there. And it sets up this, now that once she knows this, she has the capacity to absolutely ruin everything. And I forget the reason why this happened, but there was a sequence where our quartet goes to Rhea and threatens her, and Roland could have potentially killed her, but decides not to, and he ends up really regretting that because of what happens at the very end of this book. I think, I can't remember. I think she was trying to get word to Cordelia of what Susan was actually up to, trying to blow up this whole situation in front of her, and turn people against her. They were going up there because I think she used Shimi, who I really like that character, as a messenger to try to get between them. And I think it was either Cuthbert or Elaine that intercepted it. I think it was Cuthbert, actually, who intercepted that. And I think they were threatening Rhea to say that if she tried to tell someone else or use Shimi again, that they were going to kill her, even though Roland could have killed her. And again, this was an awesome sequence here where after Cuthbert discovers this, he confronts Roland and physically hurts him to try to wake him up. And this is where Roland is very regretful and knows that he's made a huge mistake, that all this other stuff has been going on. People know about this, even though Susan and Roland thought that nobody did. And he realizes that he put Susan himself and Cuthbert and Elaine all in danger by letting this situation persist. And this is where, again, I think you get so much of that good kind of character arc from Roland, because he's not perfect in this at all. He's extremely flawed, and he has to overcome a lot of this. So then, again, the last kind of third of this flashback sequence is so excellent. This is where finally, the quartet has been coming up with this plan to destroy these oil tankers. They obviously, like, Roland wants to be able to get out of here with Susan. After this sequence happens where Cuthbert and Roland kind of like have this, where Cuthbert like really is calling Roland out and forces him to kind of come back mentally. Basically, Roland invites Susan into the quartet, and she becomes part of the plan. So what they're trying to do is, they know that there's more soldiers coming in. They know that things are not going well in the town, and that there's kind of like illicit stuff happening. So their goal is to try to destroy all this to prevent John Farson's army from being able to use it, and then essentially be able to flee town with Susan with them, and ultimately Shimi with them. And this is the sequence here that's just such a genuine and good page turner. This is where there's actually a lot that does happen in this sequence, ultimately. But I think the biggest, most key thing is that Susan gets captured and kidnapped, and she actually gets kidnapped twice, which I think is interesting. There's a part where, I don't think I've mentioned his name yet, but when I'm blanking on his name, the big coffin hunter, Jonas, I think was his name, where he actually confronts Rhea because he's trying to get the glass back from her to then give back to John Farson, and she's very reluctant to give it up. So then she ends up coming along with them, which ends up being very, very important. He ends up taking the glass from her. She's, of course, been so withered away by this, and she's losing herself because she uses this thing so much. He ends up casting her off, and she curses everybody that's around him, and just vows that she's going to get vengeance on all of them, which I think is such a good arc in this book. But then ultimately, so after Susan gets, the gunslingers are kind of able to overcome, and they kill a lot of like, I think it's Roy DePape, the one of the coffin hunters. Roland kills Jonas as well, but Reynolds, the other one, is out there, and they're able to kidnap Susan. She's able to get out with the help of Shimi, just to get captured again by Rhea. I think this was the part where I didn't need for her to get captured twice. King puts in a little bit of foreshadowing to let you know that ultimately Susan's not going to get out of this. There's these little hints in there in a few different spots. But he does a good enough job of keeping you going where you kind of hope that it's not going to be the true and that Susan's going to be able to get out of this. But ultimately she doesn't. And so she gets captured by Rhea. And again, this is kind of that like final sequence where the gunslingers are trying to destroy this entire army, be able to get back to Gilead unscathed, essentially. And it's a very riveting sequence where they drive them all into the canyon through the Thenny, and they end up killing basically all of them. But as Roland discovers, Rhea cooked up this plan basically to have Susan publicly executed as a way of getting back at her and at Roland. And so that's exactly what happens. And again, it's a very tragic ending for Susan and ultimately Roland. When he becomes across the glass after killing Jonas, he sees basically the Dark Tower, and he understands that this is the quest he has to go on. And he knows he's not going to be with Susan because this is now part of who he is and what he has to do. But when he later sees that this is what happened to Susan, he's obviously heartbroken because he was responsible for so much of it because of their choices. So again, this sequence is excellent. And it's a really good, once you get to this point, it's been a slow burn. It absolutely just like sprints to the finish, and I think it's great. So it basically ends there, and then we pick up again this kind of like extended epilogue where Susanna, Eddie, and Jake are all kind of like commenting on it to him, like talking him through it. And Roland's very shaken up having to tell about all this. So you get good back and forth. You learn a little bit more about what kind of unfolds afterwards when they get back to Gilead, and kind of some of the struggles that ensued for all of them. Again, I think it's interesting. It's a little tacked on, but at the very end of the book, you do get that sequence where it's kind of Wizard of Oz. Like, they go to this glass palace castle. They see kind of representations of Maryland's rainbow. The Man in Black is there. The TikTok man is there that they end up immediately killing, even though he somehow makes it back from, what we saw him last at the very ending of The Wastelands. Thought that was a little rushed, but it's kind of interesting that he brings him back here. And again, they have an interaction with the Man in Black. And then after this, finally, Roland tells them what happened at the very end, which is he basically, because he was tricked by Rhea, ends up accidentally murdering his mother, which I thought was an extremely gruesome and brutal sequence there. And again, you just learn through all this stuff, Roland he's really a tragic character, and you just understand so much of why this matters so much to him. And then it basically ends with them getting through the castle, and then they're kind of back on the path to the beam, and they're on their way. So what's crazy is, if you think about this 900-page book from the perspective of our quartet, hardly anything happens at all. But I think that's part of the genius of the book, is King's able to kind of weave so many of these narrative threads together, where it builds just a lot of kind of like what you feel from the characters and why you root for them and understand what they've been through. He does a really good job of this in this book. Again, some of it's not perfect. I think, like I said, some of the plotting down the stretch with what happens to Susan, I think doesn't make like a ton of sense, but I think you could chalk it up to, again, just like the flaws of Roland, like not being way too confident, not foreseeing other situations or outcomes. So I think you can kind of justify it in that sense. But some of it, I think maybe it's just like a little bit of convenient plotting with her specifically. But I think what the resolution with the gunslingers, with them fighting kind of this other army, I think is excellent. So I think high level thoughts, I think the book is great. My scale is 4 stars is great, 4.5 is amazing, and 5 is a masterpiece. I've had the Drawing of the Three, I gave 4.5. I gave The Wastelands a 4, even though I think I was between a 4 and a 4.5. I think with Wizard and Glass, I've landed that I have it above The Wastelands, but I'm still not sure if it tops the Drawing of the Three or not. So I think I'm like right at 4.5 stars, but it might be slightly under the Drawing of the Three. That book just really hooked me in a way. Not saying that this one didn't, but again, it's just a different kind of a thing because of how much of a slow burn it is. And because, again, the structure, I really think that if you could make this somehow like just the backstory in Hambry, I think this is just like an automatic 5-star book. But then you have like other things are tacked on here and there. And again, it's not a criticism of the series as a whole, because if you look at the whole arc, it just flows one thing to the next. But from the perspective of book to book, that's where I think it comes into play. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to land at 4.5 stars. Amazing book. Really, really good. And I think it's going to end up right below the Drawing of the Three for me for now. And I'm going to have to think on it more. It's possible that just how impressive all of this construction was by King might end up pushing it higher up. We'll see. I just think now kind of the format of it is holding it back a little bit. But I really don't know that you're going to get better or much better from just a character perspective between Roland, Cuthbert, Elaine, Susan, between Susan and her aunt and her fears of the mayor, and then Rhea kind of over the whole thing. You get the Coffin Hunters and John Farson's army, again, juxtaposing to Roland and his quartet. It's all constructed so good. And again, if the epilogue is a little rushed, I think that's part of it, but it doesn't really detract from how good the story is as a whole. So, man, I love this book. I love this series. I think Drawing of the Three, The Wastelands, and now Wizard and Glass, that sequence of those 3 books is about as good as it's going to get. And I'm extremely excited for Wolves of the Kala. I'm going to take a break to read some nonfiction. But I think the next fiction, the next novel that I read, I'm going to jump back into this series just because I want to see what happens. It's that good. And I think that just speaks to such of the strength of not only this book, but just the series as a whole so far. So yeah, Wizard and Glass, love this book. I'll definitely revisit this at some point. And I'll just be most excited to revisit that sequence in Hambry, no doubt. But yeah, this is the longest book in the Dark Tower series, but certainly very, very much worth a read. It's an amazing book, and I think it will ultimately be in the upper echelon of King. So thanks for listening. Probably have a couple, maybe 2 or 3 books between, and then I'll be back with my thoughts on Wolves of the Kala.